The red and blue lights were bouncing off Brenda's immaculately manicured rhododendrons, like some kind of discount suburban disco. I stood there on my own concrete driveway. My hands weren't up in the air. I wasn't being shoved against the hood of a cruiser. No, I was just standing there, pinching a single, pathetic, burnt-out wire sparkler between my thumb and index finger. It was still smoking a little bit, a tiny, wispy gray trail of smoke floating up into the warm July night air. Did I rob a bank? No. Was I running an underground cartel out of my two-car garage? Also, no. I literally lit a piece of wire coated in a metallic fuel. That was the absolute extent of my criminal enterprise, but you wouldn't know it by looking at the scene. Brenda was hanging over the low brick wall that separated our properties. She was practically vibrating with righteous indignation. She had an absolute death grip on the collar of her sensible pastel cardigan, clutching the fabric like I had just threatened to demolish her entire bloodline. Her eyes were wide, darting between me and the patrol car idling at the curb. "I saw the sparks hit my roof!" Brenda shrieked, pointing a trembling, perfectly manicured finger in my direction. "He is launching illegal airborne explosives, right next to my property line!" I looked down at the blackened wire in my hand. It was exactly 6 inches long. "Brenda," I said, my voice deadpan. "It's a sparkler. A grocery store sparkler. It literally doesn't even leave my hand. How could it possibly be an airborne explosive?" "It's the principle of the matter," she yelled back, adjusting her glasses. "Pasadena has rules. We live in a civilized society, not a war zone." Officer Miller was standing between us, shifting his weight from one heavy black boot to the other. You could see the sheer exhaustion radiating off the man. The heavy utility belt, the thick Kevlar vest in the California summer heat. And now, the agonizing reality of dealing with a suburban noise complaint on the 4th of July. He took his hat off, wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist, and let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 meaningless dispatch calls. "Look, man," Officer Miller said, turning to me. His voice was low, almost apologetic, but heavily laced with protocol. "I know it's just a sparkler. I really do. But she cited Pasadena Municipal Code 1430. She called it in specifically. They logged the ordinance number on the dispatch." "Are you serious right now?" I asked, tossing the cooled-off wire into a metal bucket I had sitting by the garage. "You're going to cite me for a stick that sparks for exactly 12 seconds? "My hands are tied," he replied, pulling a thick citation book from his chest pocket. "Pasadena Municipal Code has a strict zero-tolerance policy on all residential fireworks. Safe and sane, sparklers, smoke bombs, doesn't matter. If it sparks, pops, or smokes, it's a violation. I have to write you up." I stared at him. Then I looked over his shoulder at Brenda. She was smiling. It wasn't a big, overt smile. It was a tight, smug, deeply satisfied little smirk. She took a slow sip from a ceramic mug of herbal tea she had apparently brought out just to watch the show. She was enjoying this. She was actively thriving on my minor legal inconvenience. "How much?" I asked, crossing my arms. Officer Miller clicked his pens. "It's a Class A municipal nuisance violation. The fine is $500. $500. I repeated the words slowly, letting them hang in the heavy night air. "For a sparkler. On the 4th of July. On my own property." "Take it up with the city, man," Miller said, his pen scratching against the carbon copy paper. The sound was deafening in the quiet cul-de-sac. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Every stroke was Brenda winning. Every stroke was a victory for the neighborhood watch overreach. He ripped the pink slip from the pad. The sound was sharp. He handed it to me. I took the laminated feeling paper. feeling the heat of the interaction settle into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. "Have a good night," Miller said. He didn't mean it. He walked back to his cruiser, got in, and killed the lights. The disco was over. I stood in the driveway alone. Brenda was still at the wall. "I hope you learned a valuable lesson about community safety," she called out, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I didn't yell back. I didn't throw a tantrum. I just looked at the pink slip in my hand, then looked up at Brenda. I didn't say a word. I just turned around and walked into my house. She wanted a firework violation? Fine. I walked straight into my home office, didn't even turn on the overhead lights, and dropped the pink citation on my desk. I cracked open a cold can of soda, the carbonation fizzing loudly in the dark room. The glow of my computer monitors woke up, casting a harsh blue light over the walls. She wanted to play the ordnance game. She wanted to weaponize the municipal code against a 12-second sparkler. Okay, I'd give her a firework violation, but I wouldn't just give her sparks. I'd give her a literal explosive finale, and I would make it perfectly, indisputably, legally bulletproof. It was time for some sovereign ruling. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. Clack, clack, clack. I didn't search for ways to fight the $500 ticket. That was amateur hour. That was playing defense. I needed to go on the offensive. I pulled up the California State Fire Marshal regulations. Then I opened a new tab and pulled up the full, unabridged PDF of the Pasadena City Code. I spent 3 hours reading. I read through zoning laws, noise ordinances, fire safety protocols, and public disturbance statutes. My eyes were burning, but the spite was keeping me wide awake. The caffeine and the sheer, petty adrenaline were a potent mix. And then, right around 3:00 a.m., buried deep in the appendices of Title 14 of the Pasadena Municipal Code, I found it. The holy grail of bureaucratic loopholes. Yes, residential fireworks are 100% illegal in Pasadena. 0 exceptions for civilians. However, Section 14.30.050, exemptions for commercial public displays. I leaned closer to the monitor. The glow reflected off my glasses. The code clearly stated that the ban on residential fireworks did not apply to officially sanctioned, permitted, and commercially operated public pyrotechnic displays designed for community cultural enrichment. There it was, the crack in the armor. If you hold a state pyrotechnic operator license, hire a licensed contractor, and pull a special event permit signed by the fire chief for a community cultural event, you are entirely unequivocally exempt from the residential noise and fire ordinances. Could I do this? It would require an insane amount of paperwork. It would require state background checks. It would require finding a sponsor, getting an insurance bond, and spending thousands and thousands of dollars. I looked at the $500 pink slip sitting on my desk. Then I thought about Brenda's smug, tea-sipping face over the brick wall. Is it worth spending the equivalent of a used car just to absolutely ruin Brenda's Saturday? Absolutely. The next morning, the real work began. I wasn't just planning a party, I was engineering a legal siege. Step 1 was getting the state license. You don't just walk into the DMV and ask for a license to handle explosives. You have to earn it. Over the next 4 weeks, my life became a blur of bureaucratic hoops. I enrolled in a state-mandated pyrotechnics safety course. I sat in a stifling, windowless conference room in an industrial park for 16 hours, learning about blast radii, mortar tube angles, and the exact chemical composition of black powder. I took a written exam that was harder than my college finals. I had to go to the local precinct, the same precinct Officer Miller dispatched from, to get my fingerprints taken for a Department of Justice background check. When my official state pyrotechnic operator license arrived in the mail, it was the most beautiful piece of plastic I had ever seen. It was my golden ticket. But a license isn't enough. You need the permits. I walked into Pasadena City Hall on a Tuesday morning, armed with a manila folder thick enough to stop a bullet. I approached the special events desk. The clerk, a woman named Carol, who looked like she hadn't smiled since 1998, barely looked up from her computer. "How can I help you?" she droned. "I need to file a special event permit for a community light demonstration," I said, sliding the massive stack of paperwork across the counter. Carol sighed, adjusted her glasses, and started flipping through the pages. I had filled out everything. The noise variance request, the street closure notification, the environmental impact waiver, and the crown jewel, the application for a commercial public pyrotechnic display. "You want to set off commercial-grade fireworks in a residential zone?" Carol asked, finally looking up at me. Her expression was a mix of confusion and extreme annoyance. "Technically," I corrected, pointing to a highlighted section on the surveyor's map I had included. "My property line abuts the city easement for the storm drain corridor, which is classified as municipal public use land. According to Zoning Code 8.12, permitted cultural events can utilize adjacent public easements provided a licensed operator is on site and the safety radius is maintained." Carol stared at me. She stared at the map. She flipped to the back of the packet to see my attached $2,000 cashier's check for the permit application fees. "The event is titled the Sovereign Ruling Community Light Demonstration," I added, smiling politely. "It's a cultural celebration of local illumination." She didn't care enough to argue. Bureaucrats rarely do when the paperwork is flawless and the check clears. "I'll submit it to the fire chief's office for review," she said, stamping the top page. "You'll hear back in 10 to 14 business days." 14 days later, the golden stamp of approval arrived in my inbox. I had the permit. The fire chief had signed off. It was officially sanctioned. Now, I needed the firepower. I couldn't just buy stuff from a roadside tent in Nevada. I needed Class B commercial mortars, the kind they use at theme parks and stadium shows. To get those, I needed a licensed commercial staging company. Enter Gary. I met Gary at a diner off the interstate. Gary was a grizzled, half-deaf pyrotechnics contractor who smelled permanently of sulfur, cheap black coffee, and unlit cigars. He looked like a man who had lost his eyebrows in the 80s and never bothered to grow them back. I slid my permit, my state license, and my property map across the sticky diner table. Gary picked up the map, squinting at the red circles I had drawn. He took a sip of his coffee. "So," Gary rasped, his voice sounding like gravel in a blender. "Let me get this straight. You want to set off a $10,000 commercial rig in a residential cul-de-sac?" "Technically, it's a public park boundary that abuts a residential zone," I replied, leaning forward. "And yes, I have the city permit right here, completely cleared by the fire marshal." Gary picked up the permit. He read the fire chief's signature. He looked at the address. Then he looked at me. A slow, terrifying grin spread across his face, revealing a gold tooth. "Son," Gary chuckled, tapping the permit against the table. "I don't know who you're trying to piss off, but I absolutely love your style. Let's build a bomb." Honestly, the look on Gary's face was just the beginning of what I can only describe as the most glorious, maliciously compliant weekend of my entire life. I mean, we literally spent the next 3 days going over the site maps, calibrating the electronic ignition boards, and measuring the exact trajectory of wind patterns over Brenda's roof. Gary didn't mess around. He treated my cul-de-sac like it was the main stage at a heavy metal festival. Friday morning rolled around. It was, I guess, exactly 7:15 a.m. when the heavy-duty diesel engines of Gary's commercial box trucks started echoing through the quiet Pasadena streets. Beep, beep, beep. The agonizingly loud, high-pitched backing up alarm of a 3-ton commercial staging vehicle just violently shattering the pristine suburban morning silence. I was standing in my driveway holding a mug of coffee, just watching it happen. Gary had brought a crew of 3 guys who looked like they literally wrestled alligators for fun. They started unloading the gear. And I'm not talking about cute little cardboard boxes of Roman candles. I mean, they were hauling out these massive, thick, black fiberglass mortar tubes. Dozens of them. They were bolting them into heavy wooden racks and wiring them together with miles of copper firing wire. It looked less like a neighborhood party and more like we were setting up a surface-to-air missile defense system right on my property line. And we placed them exactly, and I mean literally down to the millimeter, on the surveyed edge of my property that abutted the municipal storm drain easement, which, by absolute coincidence, happened to be directly, unobstructed, in the line of sight of Brenda's back patio. It didn't take long. By 7:30 a.m., I heard the familiar, violent rattling of Brenda's sliding glass door being thrown open. She marched out onto her patio, wearing a plush pink bathrobe, her hair still wrapped in rollers, holding a newspaper like a rolled-up weapon. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the fiberglass tubes pointing toward the sky. I could honestly see the gears grinding in her head as she tried to process the sheer scale of the artillery battery being erected 50 feet from her rhododendrons. "What in the name of God are you doing?" she shrieked, her voice cracking halfway through the sentence. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. "Morning, Brenda. Just setting up for the cultural event." "Cultural event?" She marched right up to the low brick wall, her face turning a shade of crimson that I didn't even know human skin could achieve. "Those are commercial explosives. You are building a terrorist training camp in your backyard. I am calling the HOA. I am calling the mayor. I am calling the FBI." Gary paused what he was doing. He was holding a massive 6-inch aerial shell that looked like a bowling ball wrapped in craft paper. He just stared at her, chewed on his unlit cigar, and then looked at me. "Friend of yours?" Gary grunted. "Neighborhood watch," I replied. Brenda was literally hyperventilating now. "You can't do this. It is illegal. It is highly illegal. I am calling the police right now. You are going to prison." I leaned over the hood of my car, honestly just soaking in the absolute panic radiating off of her. I mean, this was the moment I had spent 2 grand and weeks of bureaucratic misery for. "Go ahead, Brenda," I said, my voice completely flat and calm. "Tell them to bring donuts. Gary likes the glazed ones." She let out this high-pitched sound of pure rage, spun on her fuzzy pink slippers, and stormed back into her house, slamming the glass door so hard I genuinely thought it was going to shatter. "She's gonna call the cops, kid," Gary said, not missing a beat as he wired the mortar shell into the firing board. "I know," I said, smiling. "I'm counting on it." It took exactly 14 minutes. I guess Pasadena PD doesn't mess around when someone calls dispatch screaming about commercial explosives in a residential zone. The cavalry didn't just arrive, they swarmed. It wasn't just a single cruiser this time. 3 patrol cars ripped into the cul-de-sac, tires screeching, and right behind them was a massive red SUV with official Pasadena Fire Department decals slapped on the side. Doors flew open. Hands were resting on duty belts. And leading the pack was none other than my old buddy, Officer Miller. But he wasn't alone. He had a stern-looking sergeant with him, and a very unhappy fire marshal clutching a clipboard. Brenda burst out of her front door before the cops even had time to close their car doors. She was practically sprinting down her driveway, pointing frantically at my yard. "There, right there," she yelled, practically crying with vindication. "Arrest him! Arrest all of them! They are building bombs!" The sergeant approached my driveway, his hand raised in a universal "stop everything" gesture. "All right, everyone freeze! Step away from the equipment!" Gary and his crew just casually stepped back, putting their hands in their pockets. They've done this 100 times. They knew the drill. "Sir," the sergeant barked, walking straight up to me. "We received a frantic call about illegal commercial-grade explosives being staged in a residential area. You need to explain to me exactly what is going on here, right now, or I am putting everyone in cuffs." Brenda was standing right behind the sergeant, arms crossed, nodding vigorously. She was literally vibrating with anticipation. She was waiting for the handcuffs to come out. She was waiting for my absolute downfall. "Officer Miller, good to see you again," I said, keeping my hands visible. "Sergeant, Marshal, I'd be happy to explain." I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a thick, bright yellow envelope. "I'm not building bombs," I said clearly, pulling out the first document and handing it to the sergeant. "I am hosting a city-sanctioned, officially permitted, commercial public pyrotechnic display for community cultural enrichment." The sergeant snatched the paper out of my hand, scowling. His eyes scanned the document. Then they stopped. He blinked. He read it again. "This is a special event permit," the sergeant muttered, sounding confused. "Signed by the chief of police and the mayor's office," I added. I pulled out the next document and handed it to the fire marshal. "That is my personal California State pyrotechnic operator license," I said. "And the attached packet is the commercial insurance bond, the site safety plan, the blast radius survey, and the specific signature of approval from the Pasadena fire chief." The fire marshal grabbed the packet. He flipped to the back page. He stared at the signature of his own boss. He looked up at the fiberglass tubes, then looked back at the paper. "Chief Davis signed off on this?" the marshal asked, his voice completely void of emotion. "He did," I smiled. 2 weeks ago. Paid the fees and everything." Brenda was losing her mind. "What are you talking about? It's illegal. Section 1430. He got a ticket for a sparkler. You can't let him do this." "Ma'am, please step back," Officer Miller said, trying to corral her as she kept trying to peek over the sergeant's shoulder. The fire marshal walked past me and started inspecting Gary's setup. He checked the wiring. He measured the distance from the tubes to the nearest structure. He checked the commercial labels on the shells. Gary just stood there, chewing his cigar, handing the marshal whatever technical spec sheets he asked for. After about 10 minutes of agonizing silence, the fire marshal walked back over to the sergeant. He nodded once. "It's totally up to code," the fire marshal sighed, sounding defeated. "Blast radius is mathematically perfect. They're using the municipal easement as the firing zone. The insurance is solid. It's a fully legal, permitted commercial display." The sergeant handed me my paperwork back. He looked completely exhausted. He looked at me, then looked at the absolute fortress of fireworks Gary had built, and let out a long, heavy breath. "All right," the sergeant said. "Everything looks in order. Have a safe event." "Wait! No!" Brenda shrieked, stomping her foot on the pavement like a toddler. "You are not leaving. You cannot allow this. The noise, the fire hazard, my property values. I will not allow this." The sergeant turned around slowly. He looked down at Brenda, and honestly, the sheer bureaucratic authority dripping from his voice was like music to my ears. "Ma'am," the sergeant said firmly, This gentleman possesses a valid state-sanctioned permit for a commercial public event. He has jumped through every legal hoop required by the city of Pasadena. But, let me finish, ma'am, the sergeant interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. Because this is a permitted public event, it falls under municipal protection statutes. If you attempt to cross that property line, if you attempt to touch that equipment, or if you continue to interfere with their state-sanctioned setup process, I will have to arrest you for disrupting a permitted public cultural event and interfering with a licensed pyrotechnic operator. The silence that followed was deafening. I mean, you could have literally heard a pin drop on the concrete. Brenda's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted from the sergeant to Officer Miller to the fire marshal, and finally to me. I gave her a tiny, polite wave. She looked like she had just swallowed a lemon whole. Without another word, she turned around, her pink robe swishing aggressively, and power-walked back to her house. The sliding glass door slammed shut again, this time locking with a heavy, audible click. "We'll be on standby tonight during the firing window," the fire marshal told me, handing back Gary's schematics. "Don't blow up the neighborhood." "Wouldn't dream of it, sir," I smiled. The cops got back in their cars. The fire SUV pulled away. The street was quiet again. Gary walked up next to me, wiping grease off his hands with a rag. He looked at Brenda's closed blinds, then looked at the massive mortar tubes. "Kid," Gary laughed, a deep, raspy sound that came from his chest. "I think she's a little upset." "Honestly, Gary," I said, picking my cold coffee back up, "I think the cultural enrichment hasn't even begun." We spent the rest of the day finalizing the electronic ignition system. The permit dictated exactly when we were allowed to fire. Because this was classified as a late-night cultural ringing in of the new month, the city had granted a specific noise variance window. We couldn't start at 9 o'clock p.m. We couldn't start at 10 o'clock p.m. The permit specifically stated the event was to commence at exactly 11:59 p.m. By the time the sun went down, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Word had obviously spread. I saw neighbors peering out of their windows. I saw cars slowing down as they drove past my house, looking at the massive warning barricades Gary had set up at the edge of the street. The air was getting cooler. The classic Southern California night breeze kicked in. And Brenda's house was completely, utterly dark. She hadn't turned on a single light, but I knew she was in there. I could literally feel her seething through the drywall. At 11:45 p.m., Gary and I took our places behind the blast shield we had set up on my driveway. The electronic ignition board was resting on a fold-out table, covered in glowing red LED lights and toggle switches. It looked like the launch console for a space shuttle. "System is armed," Gary said, his voice suddenly very professional. He flipped the master safety switch. A loud electronic hum resonated from the board. "Continuity checks across all 12 zones are green. We have a clear launch window." I looked at my watch. 11:50 p.m. My heart was actually pounding. Did I spend the equivalent of a used car to prove a point? Yes. Did I waste weeks of my life taking state tests and filling out paperwork just to annoy one single woman? Absolutely. Am I a petty genius who is about to unleash the wrath of the gods onto a suburban cul-de-sac? Also, yes. 10 minutes, Gary called out, his eyes locked on his digital chronometer. I looked over at Brenda's dark house. I saw the blinds twitch on her second-story window. She was watching. She was waiting for me to fail. She was hoping the cops would come back, or the rig would misfire, or the city would magically revoke my permit at the last second. But none of that was going to happen. Sovereign ruling doesn't rely on luck. It relies on the absolute crushing weight of municipal law. 5 minutes, Gary announced. The neighborhood was dead silent. Not a dog barking, not a car driving by. It was the calm before the storm. The anticipation was thick, like you could honestly cut it with a knife. 1 minute. Gary handed me the master firing remote. It was a heavy black box with a single, glowing red button under a plastic safety cover. "You did the paperwork, kid," Gary said, stepping back and putting on heavy-duty earmuffs. "You get the honors. On my mark." I flicked the plastic safety cover open. I rested my thumb on the red button. 10 seconds, Gary counted down. 9, 8, 7. I stared at Brenda's house. I thought about the $500 pink slip. I thought about the 12-second sparkler. 3, 2, 1, fire. I pushed the button. There was like this agonizing split second where absolutely nothing happened. I mean, my thumb was pressed all the way down. The red light on the board was solid, but for a literal heartbeat, the cul-de-sac was still completely silent. I honestly thought for a second that I had wired something wrong and Gary was going to laugh at me. But then, the concrete driveway beneath my feet literally shuddered. It wasn't a pop. It wasn't a bang. It was a deep, chest-rattling thoom. I watched a glowing red tracer shoot out of one of the massive fiberglass tubes, tearing up into the pitch-black Pasadena sky at roughly 300 miles an hour. It left this thick, hissing trail of white smoke behind it. It went up and up and up, clearing the rooftops, clearing the massive oak trees, going so high it looked like a tiny, angry star. And then it detonated. The shockwave actually made my clothes vibrate. A blinding flash of titanium white and crackling gold completely eradicated the night sky. I mean, it literally turned midnight into high noon for about 4 seconds. The explosion echoed off the surrounding hills, rolling back down into the valley like a clap of thunder. It was the loudest, most incredibly aggressive thing I had ever heard in my life. Gary didn't even flinch. He just flipped the next toggle switch on the board. Thoom, thoom, thoom. 3 more 6-inch commercial mortar shells launched simultaneously. They exploded in a massive, overlapping canopy of glittering red, white, and blue willows that slowly drifted down over the neighborhood, raining harmless, burning ash into the municipal easement. And then, all hell broke loose on the ground. I guess the acoustic resonance of commercial-grade explosives is a little much for residential security systems, because honestly, within 10 seconds, every single car alarm within a 3-block radius started wailing. Honk, honk, honk. And then Brenda's house woke up. Her motion sensor floodlights kicked on, illuminating her backyard in blinding LED white. A second later, her smart home security alarm triggered. A high-pitched, piercing siren started blaring from her eaves. I could see the strobe lights flashing through her living room windows. Dogs were howling. People were coming out of their houses in their pajamas, looking up at the sky in absolute unfiltered shock. And Gary? Gary was literally cackling. He was standing there with his ear protection on, chewing on his cigar, laughing like a cartoon villain as he unleashed a perfectly orchestrated, mathematically precise barrage of fire and fury onto my petty neighbor's exact line of sight. We didn't just do a couple of shots, either. I had paid for the deluxe package. For 18 straight minutes, we pounded the Pasadena sky with peonies, chrysanthemums, and brocade crowns. We turned that quiet, sterile, heavily regulated suburban airspace into a literal war zone. But it was a war zone sanctioned by the mayor, approved by the fire chief, and fully insured. When the grand finale finally hit, a rapid-fire sequence of 24 titanium salutes that sounded like a carpet bombing, I could physically feel the heat on my face. The sky went completely white. The noise was deafening. And then, as quickly as it started, it was over. The last echoes faded into the hills. The smoke drifted low over the street, smelling like heavy sulfur and victory. The car alarms were still going off, and Brenda's security siren was still screaming, but the sky was dark again. Gary reached down and turned the master key to the off position. He pulled his earmuffs down around his neck and clapped me on the shoulder so hard I almost lost my footing. "Now that," Gary grinned, coughing a little bit from the smoke, "is a cultural event, kid." I honestly couldn't stop smiling. I mean, I think my face actually hurt. We spent the next hour packing up the racks, loading the heavy fiberglass tubes back into the box trucks, and sweeping up our immediate side of the blast zone. By the time Gary's trucks rolled out of the cul-de-sac, it was almost 2:00 a.m. When the sun finally came up a few hours later, the scene looked exactly like you would expect a neighborhood to look after a commercial fireworks show. The street was covered in little round pieces of burnt cardboard, ash, and paper debris. I was sitting on my front porch with a fresh cup of coffee at 7:00 a.m., just waiting. Sure enough, at 7:15 a.m., Brenda marched out of her front door. She was fully dressed this time, armed with a digital camera and a clipboard. She looked like she hadn't slept a single wink. She had massive dark circles under her eyes, and her mouth was pulled into a tight, furious line. She immediately started aggressively snapping photos of the burnt paper on her lawn, the ash on her driveway, and the little pieces of cardboard resting on her pristine rhododendrons. "You think this is funny?" she yelled, noticing me sitting on the porch. She marched to the edge of her property, waving the camera. "Look at this. This is property damage. This is a severe environmental hazard. I am suing you for the cost of professional landscaping, and I am suing you for emotional distress. You are going to pay for every single piece of trash on my lawn." I just took a sip of my coffee. "Good morning to you too, Brenda." "I have already called my lawyer," she shrieked, pointing a finger at me. "You cannot just blast toxic waste all over a residential neighborhood and expect to get away with it. You are done." "Hey, Brenda," I said, pointing down the street. "What time is it?" She blinked, totally thrown off by the question. "It's 7:20. What does that have to do with anything?" "Just wondering," I said, leaning back in my chair. Literally 2 minutes later, a massive, bright orange municipal street sweeper turned the corner into our cul-de-sac. It had its amber lights flashing, the massive rotary brushes spinning, spraying water and scrubbing the asphalt completely clean. Behind it was a city landscaping crew in a white pickup truck. Brenda watched in absolute confusion as the city workers hopped out of the truck, grabbed leaf blowers and commercial vacuums, and meticulously cleared every single piece of burnt paper and ash off her lawn, her driveway, and her bushes. They were done in under 10 minutes. They didn't even ask her for permission. They just cleaned it perfectly, waved at me, got back in their truck, and drove away. Brenda stood there on her suddenly spotless lawn, her camera hanging loosely from her wrist. What was that?" she stammered. "Oh, that," I smiled. "That was the city-mandated post-event cleanup crew. You see, when you pull a commercial special event permit, Section 8 of the application requires you to prepay the city for public works cleanup. Cost me an extra $300. But I guess it was worth it, seeing as your lawn looks better than it did yesterday." She was literally speechless. Her mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water, but Brenda was nothing if not stubborn. Exactly 3 weeks later, I got served by a very tired-looking process server. She actually did it. She took me to small claims court. She was suing me for $10,000, the absolute maximum allowed in California small claims, for intentional infliction of emotional distress, loss of sleep, and temporary loss of property enjoyment. I honestly couldn't wait for the court date. When we finally stood in front of the judge, a strict, no-nonsense older woman who looked like she had heard every petty neighbor dispute in the history of Los Angeles County, Brenda went absolutely off. She talked about the noise, she talked about her dogs, she talked about how I had orchestrated a domestic terror attack on her peace of mind. The judge listened patiently, taking notes. Then she looked over her glasses at me. "Sir, your neighbor claims you detonated commercial explosives next to her home at midnight. How do you respond?" I simply opened my manila folder. "Your Honor," I said, handing the stack of papers to the bailiff, "I am a state-licensed pyrotechnic operator. On the night in question, I hosted a fully permitted, city-sanctioned cultural event. If you look at page 4 of the exhibit, you will see the permit signed by the fire chief and the mayor's office." The judge flipped to the page. She raised an eyebrow. "Furthermore," I continued, "if you look at page 42 of the municipal application, you will find the city's standard indemnification clause for permitted public events. By approving the permit, the city legally acknowledges that temporary noise and light pollution are inherent to the event, and explicitly shields the permitted operator from civil liability regarding public nuisance claims within the approved time window." The judge read the clause. She looked at Brenda. "Ma'am," the judge sighed, setting the papers down, "he had a permit, a very expensive, very thorough permit. The city authorized the noise level, the time, and the location. You cannot sue a private citizen for a public nuisance if the city explicitly permitted the activity." "But it was loud," Brenda protested, her face turning red. "He only did it to spite me because I reported him for a sparkler." The judge actually let out a short, tired laugh. "Motivation is not illegal, ma'am. Compliance with the municipal code is what matters in this courtroom. The defendant followed every single law perfectly. Case dismissed with prejudice." The strike of the gavel was honestly the sweetest sound I had heard since the mortars went off. Brenda stormed out of the courtroom without looking at me. I haven't heard a single peep from her since. She doesn't hang out by the brick wall anymore. She doesn't stare at me when I check my mail. I guess she finally realized that she brought a municipal rule book to a sovereign ruling gunfight. So, what did we learn today? If you're going to call the cops and demand a $500 fine over a pathetic 12-second wire sparkler, you better make absolutely 100% sure your neighbor doesn't have the spite, the disposable income, and the reading comprehension to legally turn your backyard into the 4th of July grand finale.